can start now. Okay, welcome everyone to ANU Indonesia Project Global Seminar. My name is Arianto Patundru. I'm hosting this program with Nur Kamala Mulyani and Ruth Niki Julu. We acknowledge the first Australians and pay our respect to elders, past, present, and emerging. We are grateful for the support from the Australian National University and also the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So today we are going to discuss the recently launched OECD survey on Indonesian economy. We're glad to have the lead author of the report, Mr. Andrea Goldstein. He will highlight the key findings in the survey, including the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on Indonesian economy and the government responses in terms of fiscal stimulus, monetary support, as well as policy package of structural reforms. We are also excited to have Professor Hal Hill from Australian National University to comment on Andrea's presentation. So as usual, we will have question and answer session after the talks. But if you want, you can write your question anytime on the question and answer box, not on the chat box. And we will attend to them in the Q&A session, but please also kindly fill a little polling when it appears on your screen, because we need this to improve our series. So without further ado, I'll invite Andrea to start the presentation. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Ako, and thanks everybody. It's really a privilege to be here with you today, even if on Zoom, but I guess we have to adapt ourselves to the new reality where Zoom is the reality. And it's a privilege to present this OECD Economics Survey of Indonesia in front of you, in front of many friends and colleagues who know, in fact, a great deal about Indonesia and possibly much more than us. And let me acknowledge, first of all, of course, the contribution of Hal through his numerous papers, books, and presentations this year, which was very informative and influential in framing our thinking, and also the excellent survey of current events in the bulletin by Delia and colleagues from Prospera, which again was very useful for. And also because it was very refreshing, because I think some of the things that are said there cannot be said in different circumstances, but they are certainly true. Now, you are in Canberra, I'm in Sesto Levante, so if you allow me, I have a private joke with Hal, which is the second slide, which, if I manage to change slide, is proving difficult than expected. Okay, this is where I am. So, and this is where I will be for the rest of the week. And let me go now to the serious business, which is the work of the OECD on Indonesia. So let me provide you some background information where we stand in our cooperation with the Indonesian authorities and government. Indonesia was included in the 2011 in the program on key partners of the OECD. The other key partners are India and China in Asia, Brazil in Latin America, and South Africa in Sub-Saharan Africa. And in the case of Indonesia, we are now at our third joint work program covering 2019-2021, which is built around the 5 pillars: macroeconomic management and infrastructure development, which covers the sound macroeconomic and fiscal policy. So a lot of the work, of course, of this survey and previous surveys can be found in this around these 5 pillars. The second pillar is the business climate. You're now familiar with the work of the OECD on trade and investment, on regulatory reform, on which I will return during the presentation. Obviously also on competition policy and digital transformation. The third pillar is inclusive growth. Again, the OECD work since the crisis, the previous crisis. And over the years have increasingly paid attention to the issue of inclusive growth, and this is an area where we have cooperated with the government of Indonesia. And again, especially in the special chapter on human capital, you will find reference to this strand of work. The fourth is sustainable development resilience. Again, I will not spend a lot of time on the part on environmental, because I think it deserves studying alone discussion, but obviously it's an area of relevance. And last but certainly not least, the area of governance, which is very crucial for any country, and obviously it is crucial for Indonesia at this juncture. Again, a number of papers in recent years in the Bulletin of Indonesian Economic Studies have covered the issue of governance and political development. And from this point of view, as you may know, the OECD is meeting these days for the Global Forum on Anti-Corruption, where again, a lot of attention is paid to issues which are of relevance to Indonesia as well in the current juncture. And Indonesia has also participated over the years increasingly in OECD activities. Here you can see that Indonesia is the light blue. So it started from in around 2004, 2005. It was much below other key partners in terms of its participation. Now it has overtaken China, which it doesn't happen very often. So it's certainly an accomplishment, and that obviously some other of the key partners have made more progress, if you wish. I mean, from our point of view, at least it's progress in terms of participation in OECD bodies and programs. And this is the case in particular for South Africa and Brazil, which is on an accession path to the OECD. But I think that it's very interesting, again, coming from very low levels. Indonesia is increasingly part of the OECD work. And obviously for Indonesia, is crucial for the OECD also because it's the largest economy in ASEAN, and it's where the ASEAN Secretariat is located, and so there are a number, and obviously it's the only G20 country from Southeast Asia. So the involvement of the Indonesian authorities in OECD work and vice versa is crucial for our exposure and our work in that part of the world. And also you can see in the right-hand panel, the adherence to OECD legal instruments is also increasing, even if again from a very low basis. But it's increasing, and again from our point of view, it also means that it's improving with 8 instruments and 4 bodies, which Indonesia has adhered to since the first joint work program was launched in 2015. And from this point of view, in particular, it's important the ratification of the multilateral convention to prevent base erosion and profit shifting, which, as you know, is one of the core contributions of the OECD to the G20 work, but I would say also it's one of the major contributions of the G20 itself. And now, another important element here is that our relationship is mostly, but not definitely exclusively, but mostly with the Ministry of Finance. In fact, the report, the survey which I'm presenting here today was launched last Thursday by the Minister Sri Mulyani together with Secretary General Angel Gurria in another Zoom meeting. Neither had the privilege of being in Cinque Terre like myself, but still they enjoyed the presentation. And so our relationship, as I said, is mostly with the Ministry of Finance. And in this context, we have produced this is the 7th economic survey. We started with 2 nice cover pages, then we used the same one for 4 consecutive issues of the economic survey. And this year we used the one that I showed you before. Let me just you may have seen it. It shows 2 young pupils, children going to school on a bicycle on Independence Day, which we found was very illustrative of the main message of the survey this year, which is that Indonesia remains a younger country. It's a country which has to invest in education and in human capital and skills and in training. And that is possibly the main challenge for the country right now, which obviously was worse and aggravated and made more relevant by the current COVID-19 crisis. In fact, the Jakarta Post today has an article indeed on that the cost of school closure for the Indonesian society and the economy in particular. So we thought that that picture of the two children was very illustrative of the dynamism of Indonesia and the challenges ahead. In the presentation, I won't cover everything because many of the things I'm saying you are in a way much more familiar with and know more than us. So I will try to pass some messages more than anything of what we think is relevant from our perspective, which of course coincides hopefully with that of the government of Indonesia. But so I will not cover everything which is in the survey. Again, many of the things that you can find better said in the survey of current events. The work, again, of the OECD aims at being relevant, obviously, and to make an impact on our clients, on the policies adopted in member countries, but also in non-member countries. And some of the recommendations, some of the OECD standards found their way in the Indonesian policymaking framework. And again, I mentioned the BEPS as being possibly the main, so far, the main OECD instrument that Indonesia has adhered to. We recently launched the investment policy review. And to some extent, we see that reflected in ongoing investment reforms under the Omnibus Bill on Job Creation. PISA, as you know, is also very often cited and quoted in Indonesian policymaking circles. Of course, PISA is not, in some European countries, PISA, by now, I guess PISA, this survey is more is better known than the leaning towers, but and which is not maybe the case of Indonesia, but certainly we find in policy discussions on primary education in particular, ongoing reforms reference to PISA. The economic surveys and advice on labor market policies again is reflected in a number of recent reforms, and last but not least, the G20 OECD principles on corporate governance found their way in the presidential decree on beneficial ownership. Again, a very relevant issue, not only for corporate governance, but also for the fight against graft and business malpractice. So the main, I'm not reading anything new, of course, here. The main finding, if you wish, the main element of the survey is the fact that the COVID-19 hit the economy hard. It did hit the Indonesian economy to some extent a bit less than other comparable ASEAN economies, in particular Thailand. But one message we try to convey, or at least what we think, is that it's somehow it's better to think in terms of the difference between what was expected by us and by many other forecasters before 2020 and what has happened. And there, the gap is not just the 2.07% decrease in GDP that was recorded in 2020, but it was the 7%, which is adding up the 5% which was expected and the 2%. So the real cost of the crisis, and I think, again, it may have been larger or smaller in other economies, but what is important for Indonesians is what happens to them. And the cost of the crisis is 7%. So no indulgence, and that should be allowed. And again, this is, we think, is very important. As you see here, the cycle in Indonesia is very much similar to the cycle in other G20 emerging market economies. That is Argentina, Brazil, China, India, Mexico, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and Turkey. The recovery, we expect it to be slightly slower in 2021 and 2022. We project at this stage in the interim outlook that was launched a couple of weeks ago by the chief economist, Laurence Boone. We expect the GDP growth in 2021 to be around 4.8, which is similar to the best case scenario of BAPENAS in terms of the rollout of the vaccination campaign. and it's more or less the the midpoint in the Ministry of Finance projections. So, as you know, this year in particular, a lot depends obviously on the assumptions, but also because of the assumptions which have changed so fast this year, as they did last year. A lot depends on the moment you make the forecast. So the forecasting was a difficult art or a difficult technique. Even before this year, it makes a great deal of a difference the week you make it. So again, we made this in late February. We may be obliged to change it slightly. I'm not spending a lot of time again. Hopefully, some of the participants will raise this and provide more information than I have on the progress of the vaccination campaign. It's advancing, but it's not advancing possibly as fast as it could be or it should be. Again, this is a problem that many other countries are encountering, and I don't have to tell you how dramatic the situation from this point of view is in continental Europe, of all places. Obviously the crisis in 2020 and the slow recovery over the next couple of years is an interruption to a long spell of sustained growth that Indonesia has experienced since the crisis of the late 90s. Here we show the GDP per capita of Indonesia as a percentage of the OECD. And this is the blue line, and you see is a steady, even if rather slow, but still steady growth from 19% of the OECD GDP to 29–30%. And in the terms of the contribution of Indonesia to the GDP of the ASEAN community of nations, again, we also see an increase in terms of the role of Indonesia in the regional economy. So the crisis came at the wrong moment. All crises come at the wrong moment, obviously, but this one came also at the wrong moment because there were already signals of a slowdown in growth, which again are linked to the productivity. I don't have this, but in the survey, which I'm sure you can access through the ANU, at least digital library. In the survey, we provide some figures of the slowdown in productivity growth compared to comparable countries, including the low productivity OECD economies. So there are a number of comparable OECD economies, emerging economies that have a rather low level of productivity, and Indonesia, in terms of the pattern of growth of productivity, doesn't compare very favorably with some peer economies. So the crisis did come at the wrong moment. Again, I look forward to the reflections of Hal on this. One of the big achievements of the past decade has been the decrease in the poverty rate in the country. The incidence of poverty as a share of population decreased, and this crisis has had an impact which has not been as dramatic as previous crises, but certainly there's been an increase as recorded by Backman's latest survey of on poverty. And again, the survey is the economic survey goes into greater details in terms of understanding the role of the policy response in diminishing the impact on poverty and the dent on poverty of the crisis. Looking ahead, of course, what is important is not only the immediate comfort and that emergency measures can have on the poverty incidence, but whether the long-term policies that are going to be implemented really make a dent on poverty. And again, we will see in terms of our recommendations at the end whether we are recommending the right set of policies and what are the prospects of them being adopted. A key I guess, element of the crisis has obviously been the increase in the risk premium on sovereign debt, and it has increased in March and the first half of April last year, so almost 12 months ago, and it has decreased, but it remains high now. Here, I think the big risk is for Indonesia, as for other emerging economies that are not particularly, that are all vulnerable, but they are not particularly per se in a difficult situation, is of the contagion effect. We haven't seen any evidence so far. I mean, as you know, Turkey is suffering a lot these days, and we haven't seen an immediate contagion effect percolating through other emerging economies. But I would say that, and this is a point we make, and again, I look forward to the discussion on this. We say in the report that one big element in the response to the crisis and in the reaction of financial markets to the policy response to the crisis has been the credibility that Indonesian policymakers have accumulated over the past few years. On the one hand, on the fiscal front, on the other hand, on the monetary policy front. And thanks to with little fiscal space because of low tax to GDP ratio, and but still with some fiscal space built through the credibility of its policy action in the past few years, it was possible to abandon the 3% ceiling, even if temporarily, without financial markets becoming very concerned with this abandonment of fiscal frugality. The same has been true for monetary policy. Bank Indonesia has modified and has reduced the policy rate, the repo 7-day repo rate 6 times in the past 15 months or so. And again, financial markets did not react with obviously in a recession, the inflationary pressure is low, but still we think that the credibility of fiscal policy and the Ministry of Finance and the credibility of the independent Bank of Indonesia have been crucial elements in understanding the financial market reaction to the policy response. And we think that in particular in the case of the Bank of Indonesia, it's very important to preserve this independence and to be very careful when playing around, I mean, with the proposals to diminish the independence, institutional and operational independence of Bank Indonesia. Again, we know what has happened in 2020, but we understand that some proposals are still circulating, and we think that one has to be very careful in making those proposals. Our debt sustainability analysis indicates that obviously public debt will rise, but in the different scenarios, even in the one with larger primary deficit or the one higher interest rate, it will remain sustainable. And again, tax revenue is an area where we focus on which we focus our attention in 2018. In fact, I don't know whether my predecessor on the desk, Christy Lewis, is in the audience, because I don't want to touch too much. I'm on a very weak internet connection, so I don't touch anything, but maybe Chris is in the audience, and she was the main author of the 2018 survey. And obviously the tax revenue as a percent of GDP ratio remains much lower, as you can see, and as you know, than in both in the OECD average. It's basically a third of the OECD average, and half as high as the average for other G20 emerging market economies. And the recommendations that were made in 2018 were only partially adopted. Of course, 3 years is a short spell, and the crisis, it's not maybe the most opportune moment for raising taxes and tax rates, but that is an area which still obviously deserves a lot of attention, and where a lot of political capital must be spent if a government wants to advance in the reform path. I'm taking another, again, I mean, I'm talking here to people that know Indonesia a lot, but this is not always the case. So some of these things are obvious, but when we make these presentations and the survey itself is intended, of course, also for a non-Indonesian audience. So informality is pervasive. These are figures from the ILO. Of course, these are many cases, most cases estimates, and informal as a percentage of total employment remains very high. Basically, 2/3 of employment is in informal sector, and this has had obvious consequences during the crisis. What are our key recommendations? The first one, which the first and the second are connected, to prolong measures directed at providing financial support to household and business to protect livelihoods and employment, with, of course, a long-term objective of improving the targeting of these measures and of social policy measures more general. But we do not think, in the case of Indonesia, but also in the case of other OECD and non-OECD countries, that it's yet time for fiscal consolidation. Now, over the medium term, this will be needed, but it's important to avoid a premature and abrupt removal of the stimulus. And in fact, as you know, the government has, if anything, enlarged the stimulus for 2021. And this, we think, is opportune because of the high level of uncertainty that surrounds the outlook, even if the global outlook since the end of 2020 has improved. We see that in the trade figures, and obviously we see that in the adoption of the new president stimulus package in the United States. In terms of monetary policy, we again think that it's appropriate to maintain an accommodative monetary stance as long as inflation is within target, which is definitely the case. And we also think that it would be opportune to start providing markets with forward guidance on the normalization of monetary conditions. Again, this, and this is the sixth bullet point, together with a commitment on the part of the political class to continue to foster the independence of Bank Indonesia. We think that is an important element which should be preserved. Step up efforts to raise the tax revenue, and finally, as envisaged, to phase out the burden sharing agreement in 2021 and not to prolong it further. The second part of the survey, which I will be I will go very fast because I think I'm running out of time almost already, has to do with the investment climate and some very general considerations at this stage on the environment front. But these are interesting full numbers because they reflect some of our indicators. The first indicator is the so-called Fdi Restrictiveness Indexer, which was last calculated last year. And which shows, as you can see, that Indonesia is one of the most restrictive. This is calculated for some 60 economies, so 69 economies, so including the 37 OECD members, but also 32 non-members around the world. That include the Philippines and Thailand, Malaysia, and I guess, if I'm not mistaken, all ASEAN countries. And as you can see, Indonesia is the second most restrictive economy in terms of this Fdi Restrictiveness Index. And definitely there is a lot of potential in improving, in increasing the attractiveness of the country, and increasing FDI flows into Indonesia by removing some of the restrictions, which are statutory restrictions, and then the euro, not necessarily de facto. So it's a different, this is different from the doing business indicators of the World Bank. So this we think is an area, I guess, you will see the recommendations. Another indicator that is produced by the OECD is the OECD product market regulation indicators, and this again an area where Indonesia is doesn't perform very well. I mean, it's open to judgment whether, but we think that obviously the list unuseful regulation, the better. And product market regulations are stricter. As you can see, in Indonesia, they are the strictest of the G20 economies for which we have the data or we can publish the data. So there are a few economies which are not here that have more restrictive regulations, but we cannot show the results. So I let you imagine which ones. And so again, this is an area where improvement can be made. At the sub-index level, we also find something which is, we think, very interesting. There is an area where Indonesia actually performs pretty well in the sense of having a score which is very similar to the OECD average and to the most competition-friendly economy. And that's the area of administrative burdens on startups. And where, as you can see here, is the fourth column. Indonesia, sorry, performs very well. And a tentative indication that this is good for the economy. Again, I mean, it's an heroic assumption. The one I'm making is not so much of a one-to-one relationship, but still, which we find rather revealing, is that Indonesia can boast more unicorns, companies that high-tech startups that are worth more than $1 billion, can boast more of them than either Japan or Australia. There are 5 Indonesian unicorns, 4 in Japan and 3 in Australia. Of course, Australia is a much smaller economy in terms of population, so unicorns per person, there are many more in Australia than in Indonesia or Japan, but still the absolute number we think is interesting because it suggests, even again it's maybe an heroic assumption, but it does suggest that when the environment is conducive to entrepreneurship and investment, Indonesia, of course, and the Indonesians react as expected. One problem which of course remains is again on which you're much more familiar with the literature and the analysis is corruption that is still perceived to be high. And again, in terms of institutions, we think that a lot of care should be taken when dealing with the KPK, with the independence of the KPK, and which again is an institution that has performed very well. It's built its reputation inside the country, but also internationally. And we know how important is international cooperation in the area of anti-bribery fight. So we do think that extreme caution should be taken in this area, where, of course, there may be a legitimate concern regarding the actions of any institution in any country, but that it's important not to touch upon an institution that has performed well. So let me go now to the recommendations and skip the environment because it deserves a much longer, a much more serious discussion. So I don't want to delete in a light way. In terms of the recommendations we make, there is an area which is still very crucial, which is the reform of stakeholder enterprises. We think that with the new minister, there have been improvements in terms of the processes of appointment, selection and appointment of both managers and directors, but still the corporate governance of SOEs could be improved to align it with global best practices. As you know, a number of SOEs were already in a difficult financial and operational position before the crisis, and the crisis hit them hard and made it necessary to provide them with capital support. So obviously the opportunity cost of that calls for actions on the corporate governance and on subjective SOEs to competition law. The second area is in the terms of the restrictions, be they on FDI or regulations on product markets. I think that what would be important, and we have the experience of Korea, so a much richer economy, which made a major review of all the restrictions and regulations in place, and that led to the elimination of all those that were generating costs without producing benefits. And this kind of it's not even an RIA, it's some kind of monitoring of the existing legislation and removing what is really unnecessary and what is not producing any benefit. I guess it's something that Indonesia should consider in earnest. Another area which we think is very important is in government procurement. Again, something that we find also in other countries. 2020 and 2021 will definitely be years of larger public spending in infrastructure and in services. And in the emergency, there was, in many economies, in many countries, there was an increase in direct awards. And we think that it's important to limit such awards only to current, urgent, and unforeseeable needs when there really is only one qualified supplier, and terminate the direct awards as soon as possible. I think this is very relevant also for Indonesia. Let me, do I have on like 5 minutes?
Sure, go ahead.
So finally, the special chapter, which is investing in competences and skills. And I will again focus on this because it's more, now, Indonesia has enjoyed, like the rest of Asia in different moments, and the rest of South Asia and Southeast Asia in the recent past, definitely has enjoyed a demographic dividend. But this the country is going through already a demographic transition, and I have the slide here. In a few years' time, this demographic dividend will start falling. So, which makes it even more necessary to improve the human capital component of the workforce and the population in general. In terms of educational coverage, attainment, Indonesia has performed well in terms of the increase in the number of students in schools. And in terms of quality, there is ample room to improve the quality of schooling. Again, this is something that we knew already before the pandemic, and the pandemic, with its combination of school closure, low preparation for distance teaching and distance learning, insufficient access to internet, in particular to high-speed internet, and the increase in the dropout rates has obviously worsened the situation. This, again, we know this with a number of studies, especially by Brookings and by the World Bank and by OECD, also OECD countries. We know there are many estimates made, but I mean, leaving aside, of course, the details and the precise numbers and estimates, figures and estimates, we do know there is a consensus that 2020 was a terrible, and unfortunately also 21 is proving terrible year, terrible period in terms of quality of schooling and quality of educational performance. And again, in the case of Indonesia, this is reflected. And at the end, I will provide some more precise recommendations. Indonesia doesn't perform very well in PISA. The score in mathematics, which we show here, is a proof. Again, it's not necessarily the worst performing, but I think that obviously it's small consolation. That the issue is to improve, regardless of what others do, to improve. And there is a high variance in terms of the results in Indonesia, which is higher than in most other peer economies. So you have really a dual education system in terms of organization. And what can be done? Well, definitely there is an issue of resources in an economy and in a country where the tax to GDP ratio is as low as 12%. Obviously, and there is also a limit to what can be spent on education, and the gap is particularly clear in primary school. Public spending on education is much lower than in comparable. Again, here we have both G20 emerging market economies and ASEAN members, and but again across the different educational categories, you see the same with Indonesia performing worse. The one recommendations we make is to invest more in early childhood education. the percentage of new entrants to grade 1 of primary education, which have some exposure to early childhood education, is rather low. Again, it's not the lowest, but still it's pretty low. And we know from the international literature, but also from some studies in Indonesia, that early childhood education is beneficial both in terms of equity and efficiency, if you wish. Children that go to school at an early age do perform better over the whole education cycle, and households poor households where the children go to early childhood education, also the children perform better than expected. And obviously it also has an impact on female employment. We know from international experience, which is an area where Indonesia doesn't do very well. So there are, from this point of view, important. So let me skip this and go to this, which is not necessarily very easy to read, but I think it provides a good synthesis of our findings and our recommendations in the area of education. The first point, as I say, is early education is not well developed in Indonesia, and notably in rural areas. And we do encourage the authorities to consider lowering the starting age of compulsory education, which right now is 7 years, which is relatively high by international standards. The increase in educational attainment came at the expense of the household budgets, which cover nearly half of total education expenditures from a third a decade ago. And this, of course, is an unequal finding that points to inequity, and because obviously the burden is particularly difficult to sustain for poorer families. And so we encourage authorities to increase their efforts, especially in tertiary education. This is an area where some progress has been made, but in terms of scholarships, but more can be made also in terms of subsidized loans to university students. The ratios of pupils to schools and to teachers are particularly low, while infrastructure is insufficient in many schools. So there are too many schools, and in Indonesia, which is of course also a reflection of its geography, that this is obvious, but we think that the number of schools, the distribution of schools, school buildings, also school buildings are in many cases in very bad conditions. The physical equipment is not up to standards. So that's an area where a review of the geography of schools in the different parts of the country would be welcome, because also there is a possible space for envisaging using multi-grade teaching. And there is a wide variety dispersion in terms of spending per pupil, and again there is as you may imagine from the OECD, we encourage the collection of best practices, in this case across Indonesia, not only copy and pasting from international cases. And there is a space to introduce more performance metrics in the allocation of education funds at the school and at the district levels. Again, the benchmarking, of course, the benchmarking requires having a good data, which is the first step, but then also requires the political will and the will to use political capital to make progress on this front. Teacher performance is an area which we have found in also many other countries, and including in countries that I'm working on right now with my colleague Robert Brunke, who is probably in the audience. We are also covering 2 other economies on the desk together with Indonesia, namely Tunisia and India, and we are looking now at similar issues in the case of Tunisia, where again teacher performance is crucial for learning outcomes, and in Indonesia as a kind of unique, or at least a peculiar feature of Indonesia, is that a very high number of teachers do not have a permanent contract, and that of course is reflected in terms of the investment that teachers themselves can make. And so we encourage to increase the number of teachers with permanent contracts, but of course also to have to require them to have to meet certain conditions. Let me skip some because I'm really running out of time, and I'm sorry for this, and go to the last point, which I think is very relevant in this context with you in Canberra, which is that there is an opportunity, we think, which some other economies and countries in Southeast Asia have already taken advantage from, which is foreign investment in tertiary education in universities. And as part of the trade agreement with Australia, Indonesia has allowed foreign investment in education, and the first, as far as we know, the first one to seize this opportunity has been Monash University, which already is present in Malaysia and in Vietnam, which has announced the forthcoming opening of its first campus in Indonesia. And I think this is an area where there is potential. Again, we see other economies, not only in Southeast Asia, but also more generally in Asia, including, for instance, Korea, that have opened up their tertiary education system to foreign investment, and we think that is an area where Indonesia can consider doing more and attracting in an economy in a country with such a huge population. There is obviously a huge potential for foreign investment. And again, with my apologies for overextending my time, I thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to comments from Alan and others.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That's very comprehensive. But for the interest of time, let's just go straight to Hal to hear his comments on your presentation. So Hal, over to you.
Thanks very much, Acho, and thank you to Acho and your team, Nuka and Ruth and others, for again running a wonderful Indonesia webinar series. Last year was a really bright spot in an otherwise gloomy year, the weekly seminars, and so is this year. Good morning to Andrea, my good friend Andrea. Thank you for getting up very early to talk to us, and thank you for an excellent report. I was going to say, Andrea, I do of course feel sorry for you in lockdown, but I've got a sneaking suspicion that you're locked down in a very beautiful part of the Italian coast, maybe near Cinque Terre. So of course, the COVID situation is serious, but if you're going to be locked down anywhere, that must be one of the most beautiful places to be locked down. Okay, so on the report, which I think is very good. So as Andrea mentioned, Indonesia is not a member of the OECD. It's one of, I think, as he said, 5 major developing countries it monitors and engages with. Just for the record, and for those who may not know as much of the history, the OECD was historically a rich country club, essentially North Atlantic rich economies. Even Australia and New Zealand didn't join from memory until the early 1970s. And it still, I think, only has 3 Asia-Pacific countries in it. That is Japan, South Korea, and Australia, and New Zealand, of course, it's 4. But things are changing, and the world is changing, and the OECD is changing, and no doubt this will be a trend in the future, greater engagement with this dynamic part of the world. In addition, of course, the incoming Secretary General happens to come from this part of the world as well. So the great strength of this report is its analytical quality and its comparative analysis. I want to emphasize those 2 points, its comparative analysis and its arm's length analytical quality. The OECD doesn't have loan programs like World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and it doesn't have perhaps the deep country immersion that, say, the 2 banks have, but it's able to do this excellent arm's length work without necessarily having to promote a program. And some debate about the merits or otherwise of that, but I think it's a plus. That its reports are invariably high quality and eagerly anticipated. Now, before I go any further, I want to engage in a brief exercise in shameless promotion for the Indonesia project. I don't know whether you can see it on the screen, but this is the latest output from the Indonesia project, literally this week. It's the latest Indonesia update volume, edited by our good friends here, Blaine Lewis and Firman Witula, the Indonesia update's a major annual event, almost 40 years continuously, and this is the product of it. Okay, so back to the report after that shameless promotion. So I think Andrea has produced and colleagues produced a really balanced and comprehensive report. It's very polite, as befits its authorship, but it's clear enough. The careful reader gets the message, I think, very clearly. It distills a very large literature on what we know about Indonesia, and it gives us, as I say, this comprehensive and balanced picture of Indonesian economic development and key policy issues. I'll refer to this a couple of times in the following remarks, but just to emphasize again, the comparative story, I think, is a real strength, and it compares Indonesia with relevant comparators, not with the rich members of the OECD, but with a range of middle income economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Turkey, and so on. I think that's very, very useful. Incidentally, Indonesia sometimes gets put in the wrong company. It missed out on being a BRIC, but it's done better than the resource-rich parts of the BRICS. And it was put in with the fragile 5 for a while, back after Ben Bernanke's remarks in 2013, and it's generally done better than those. The key message in the report is, as you'd expect, Indonesia has performed satisfactorily, but it could do better. It could lift economic growth and therefore lead to a faster improvement in living standards, subject to, of course, to environmental constraints. I think the summary findings and recommendations in the hard copy report there on page 12 are all very good and sensible, so certainly worth reading. So I'm going to follow the flow of the presentation more or less and make some comments along the way as I proceed, mainly focusing on the first chapter since I'll probably run out of time for the second chapter. I'll also mainly pass over the short-term COVID analysis, which I think is very well covered. It's well known Indonesia's economic response to the COVID crisis has actually been reasonably effective with a lag. A somewhat puzzling feature is the Indonesian economy was not so badly affected as some of its comparators. Indonesia contracted about 2% of GDP last year. India, Thailand, Philippines, much, much worse. So interesting question around there. I think it is partly, but not wholly, related to the fact that the country has had this history of prudent economic management, which the report draws out with caveats. And the caveats, again, are well known. The report argues correctly, in my view, that the country should return to the pre-crisis macroeconomic policy settings on fiscal policy and on monetary policy, especially independence of the central bank. And in a sense, these two key institutions are somewhat insulated from the political processes, the political argy-bargy, if you like. And just on the macro, the report highlights correctly, I think, some of the caveats in the macro's policy story. In particular, the tax effort is very low, way too low for what was and will become again an upper middle income economy with a community which demands services which the government cannot fund with an 11% tax to GDP effort. Of course, it's lower at the moment. And that's partly because of tax compliance issues. It's partly because of there are too many exemptions. Also, as the report points out, rather low property taxation, which has both efficiency and equity implications for it. The other potential macroeconomic vulnerability pointed out by the report again is that the reliance on foreign borrowings, short-term capital flows to finance deficits. Incidentally, in passing, the report doesn't mention it, but it's obvious. Indonesia almost certainly can't go to the IMF in times of economic crisis, and the regional financial safety net arrangements known as CMIM don't appear to be operative. So that's the macro story. I think it covers it very well. The one bit of the fiscal story which maybe could be elaborated on in future reports is the urgent need to reform intergovernmental fiscal relations, that is between the centre and the region, which, for example, my ANU colleague Blaine Lewis is one of the world authorities on. But one report can't cover everything. The report also correctly emphasises that the COVID crisis exposed well-known deficiencies in the health system, including, I guess, frankly, it has to be said right at the very top, and some of the governance issues which are discussed in passing in the report, and social protection. And that gets a tick in the report rightly, although its scale and coverage is an issue. So that's the general story. Let's move on now and go through the report in more detail. The next part of the report says, quote, Indonesia could gain more from globalization, unquote. I think this is a central proposition. Indonesia, as we know, has always had an ambivalent view towards globalization. And I think in the process, it's missed out on a lot of the opportunities for employment creation, for technology acquisition, and for financial flows. It's missing out on the global production networks, which account for more than half of intra-East Asian trade. My colleague at ANU, Premachandra Attakoril, is the world expert on it, and it comes out always very clearly as a laggard, like the PhD thesis of one of our former students, Dr. Mukti as well. Part of the issue is highlighted, in fact, by one of the slides that Andrea showed us, which is according to the OECD's Regulatory Restrictiveness Index towards foreign investment, and that's in figure 116 of the report. Indonesia is one of the most restrictive countries towards FDI. So it's really, I think this part of the report is very important. Indonesia is missing out. And it's also, incidentally, forcing the country to some extent to fund these deficits, especially fiscal deficits, from somewhat volatile short-term capital flows. There's talk also in the globalization story about these various trade agreements, RCEP and so on, bilaterals, including with Australia. I think they're relevant, but they're really only relevant providing they're consistent with the broad thrust of domestic trade policy, which, as the esteemed host of this webinar series, Acho Patunru, has shown us, is still a major challenge in policymaking for Indonesia. In passing, just a reminder, President Jokowi, for all his strength, has actually had 5 trade ministers in his 6.5 years as president. Onward to the next section, state enterprises, and I see my esteemed colleague at ANU, Ross McLeod's already posed a question here. And this is the sort of issue of regulatory barriers in the state enterprise sector, another story which has been a consistent feature of post-independence Indonesian economic policy making. And here again, the report highlights some of the virtues of the OECD comparative analysis. It shows, for example, with this index called the Product Market Regulation Index, that Indonesia has very high barriers to firm entry and competition. They're in figures 119 and 120 of the report. So again, very important point. It could perhaps be unpacked. It can't be unpacked in this report. And I think OECD itself has done specialist papers on it just to draw attention to this point. It's crucial, I think, in terms of thinking about industrial organization and dynamism, and also in the big debate in Indonesia about the importance of SMEs, small and medium enterprises. If you've got competitive barriers and barriers to entry, it's going to be harder for new startups. So that part of the report I think is very useful. I have to say, in passing, Indonesia on the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business, now paused of course, did show this dramatic improvement, like in about 40 places up the ladder in recent years. And I've always sort of been puzzled by that. It's not a criticism of the bank, which has, well-established methodology, but I think I find this OECD analysis persuasive. So on the related point, the state enterprise sector, the report calls them, quote, omnipresent and powerful, unquote, and gives numerous illustrations for that proposition. The question, as always, is how to reform. And why has reform been more difficult? Well, it's been more difficult for the obvious political economy reasons that ownership in Indonesia is still a very sensitive issue, who owns what. And it's also a sensitive issue because, as we know, senior Indonesian bureaucrats who aren't particularly well remunerated often have very large salary supplementations through sitting on state enterprise boards. boards, state enterprises, incidentally, which sometimes they also regulate as bureaucrats. So there's a potential, maybe actual conflict of interest. So SOE reform is really tricky. Question is how to proceed in this kind of political economy minefield. If we cast our minds back to the 1980s and the great crusading reforms of the late Minister Ali Wadana, who reformed so successfully in the 80s, why Indonesia didn't have a crisis in the 80s, like most other developing country exporters. I think Ali would have reminded us that there are several ways to skin the cat. You can at least impose greater transparency on SOEs. You certainly want to create greater competitive pressures in their operation, and you want to have hard budget constraints. So if privatization, the question Ross McLeod is asking, if privatization may be the first best, only the first best, by the way, if it's accompanied by a competitive business environment, privatizing a public monopoly wouldn't achieve much. But if privatization is going to be just too difficult, can you think of ways of ensuring that at least the costs of the state enterprise inefficiencies are better handled? So just consolidating the number of SOEs obviously doesn't make much difference. A related point, of course, is to do that, you have to, in fairness to the senior government officials who sit on the boards, you have to reform the public sector remuneration structure, since that's part of the reason why they're not being changed. Related, by the way, the report has some very useful comments on public procurement issues and reform, also highlighting the concern about the apparent weakening of the KPK, which I think is the Indonesian Anti-Corruption Agency, which I think is still just about the most popular institution in the country. So if it isn't supported in the parliament, it's certainly supported in the streets. So I'm running out of time, so I'll pass over the rest pretty quickly. There's very good discussion of environmental issues in the report. Nothing particularly new, but it highlights, I think, all the important points. It does, by the way, remind us that fuel subsidies are still about 1.7% of GDP. That's a lot. It's not much less than what is spent on social protection. And it's even at a time of relatively low oil prices. So if oil prices go up again sharply, I think that issue has not gone away. For the obvious reason, I guess, that prices aren't linked automatically to domestic prices to international prices. Okay, so on to chapter 2, labour market skills. I'm running out of time and I agree with practically everything. So let me just quickly highlight what I think are some of the key points. Impressive quantitative indicators in education, that's very important. But as the report says, education quality remains quote unquote disappointing. The report points out that the era of demographic bonus is fading, that is due to the changing age structure. Incidentally, our demographic expert at ANU, Professor Terry Hull, who may be listening, would remind us, may remind us that the 2020 population census results are somewhat problematic and a little bit ambiguous. There's the question also of high-level labour market informality, including a very interesting comparative graph. Again, Indonesia has apparently very high levels of informality. Again, I guess the question is the political economy. That's partly just the stage of development, but partly the country's labour market regulatory regime, which Chris Manning and others, of course, have written so much about. And so how can the policies be changed and get past the vested interest, both in the unions and the employers, to change it? Question mark, again, with the omnibus law. Several places in the report, there's a reference to the hoped for impact of the omnibus law. We're still waiting, I guess. It's work in progress, whether it will really have an impact or not. Important report on investing in early childhood education. I think that's crucial. The other interesting point is on education spending, the report emphasises or notes the 20% budget requirement, which looks pretty good. But of course, when you've got such low tax revenues, 20% of a small total doesn't look quite as good as the comparative numbers show. And rising teacher salaries haven't yet apparently led to really commensurate improvements in education outcomes. Here, of course, the OECD's own PISA reports are very useful international benchmarks widely referred to in Indonesia. Our erstwhile colleague Daniel Suryadharma, of course, has written a lot on that. The report very politely says, quote, the education system and its actors are resistant to change, unquote. A masterly and very accurate understatement, which I think gets at what they're trying to argue for. Another important point just to emphasize is, as they say, because a lot of the education is now financed by households because of relatively low public spending, education doesn't contribute much to lowering interpersonal and interregional inequality. So again, another important point to draw out. Also, of course, the gender gap is persistent and present, not as high as some other comparator countries in the Islamic world, but still quite high. Then on to TVET, vocational education. Another, it needs to be enhanced. Another, what we would say in Indonesia, a lagu lama, an old song. Chris Manning and others have been writing about it for probably 25 or 30 years. Question again is how to incentivize and motivate the bureaucracy and the actors to actually make change. The same comment, by the way, I think applies to Andrea's closing comment about foreign investment in education, starting with Monash University, of which of course I'm a proud alumni. Whether it will be able to achieve the desired results will depend a lot on that education bureaucracy, which the report notes is somewhat resistant to change. So again, question mark. Very important point, I'm just closing now, very important point about digital education. The figure that, for example, 1/3 of senior upper secondary schools lack access to computers. Indonesia lagging in this respect, partly, of course, because of the challenge of this vast archipelagic geography. But it's especially true in the time of COVID that has been a factor which has exacerbated inequality, since it's the poorer households which will be missing out more on schooling. The labour market informality, I've mentioned already, it's in the report calls it pervasive. Indonesia second highest in the figure 218, behind only India, and for similar reasons, and labour market rigidity. Also the female labour force participation is stagnant and rather low, as Chris and Lisa Cameron and others have shown. So that's about my summing up. There's lots of issues which could have been covered. It's not a criticism to say they weren't covered, because one report sure can't cover everything. Sort of standing back a bit, I'm sort of drawn to some of these political economy questions. Quite often crises are a trigger for governments being a bit bolder than normal and undertaking significant reform. There's a history of that in Indonesia, mid-60s, mid-80s, late 90s. Not clear whether this is going to happen. And this is sort of, I guess, beyond the remit of the OECD anyway, whether it will happen. The omnibus law may lead to major changes. We got to see whether it's going to work. One of the many issues which the report can't possibly be expected to discuss, but on which the OECD would have a lot of expertise, is this proposal to establish a sovereign wealth fund in Indonesia. It's got some unusual features. It's somewhat controversial. Perhaps we could discuss it in the Q&A session. Not clear that it's really the solution to addressing, what the investment issue. And the report, it very politely says Indonesia may have a new capital city. Again, it might have been an opportunity to sort of put its oar in the water and row a bit harder, but there are so many issues to cover, and it can't cover everything. And what it does cover, I think, is excellent. So congratulations to Andrea and team. I enjoyed reading it. Thanks very much. I turn back to you.
Thank you so much, Hal. Very detailed as usual. Let's now hear some reactions from the floor. We have 75 participants, and I see 2 hands already, and that's from 2 different Peters. So let's start with Peter Macaulay.
Hi, Peter Macaulay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I have 4 points. I will work through them quite quickly. The first is my overall point, and many thanks to the OECD for presenting this report. This is one of a series of reports over a series of years, and I'm looking at this now from a multilateral point of view, the engagement of the multilateral community with Indonesia. One of my main concerns, and I'll give 2 examples of this, one of my main concerns is that multilateral organizations, including the OECD, approach Indonesia and other developing countries with what I might call an OECD point of view. a first world point of view. Let me give two examples. The first is that in one of the earlier slides, and thank you very much for this, one of the earlier slides, there was a listing of the plans for the OECD engagement with Indonesia. There were 4 or 5 columns, as I recall. I don't have the slide in front of me, but the point is that this 4 or 5 columns amounts to what we can call in the international development dialogue a Christmas tree of issues.
Peter, you're on mute. Peter, we cannot hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I'm not sure where you lost me. My main point was that there is a Christmas tree of issues. There are too many issues. The international community, including the OECD, is setting out a whole range of issues. And looking at your earlier slide, the slide really had too many issues that are developing. All of these issues, look at them all. There are what, 12 or 15 issues here. There are just far too many issues. Macroeconomic management, business climate, inclusive growth, sustainable development and governance. It is just too much. A developing country simply cannot deal with all of these issues. So overall, the OECD needs to consider the agenda it sets in dealing with itself, first world countries and developing countries. A second point here, which is part of the same point, is that the OECD document, the OECD report, which I have looked at, which is very useful. Thank you very much. But it has a range of indicators which are OECD averages. Now, OECD averages are not useful for the developing world. This column of OECD averages really should be removed, and OECD needs to find some other way of looking at its relationships with developing world. So that is my first overall point about OECD view. I have 2 other small points to mention, which relate to discussions in the report. The first is to do with tax revenues, and the second is to do with foreign direct investment. First, in tax revenues, there is a very useful discussion, very useful comment. Thank you very much in your page 12, as a matter of fact, about the economic collection, but the economic tax revenues collected by Indonesia. But the real issue here is that this issue has been an issue in Indonesia for at least 40 years. This low issue of tax revenues and government expenditure is what we call in our Indonesian discussion a lagu lama. And in your discussion of these things, your listing of efforts to raise the tax revenue, you've listed a number of them. To be honest, we've heard these things for many years. We need to get beyond this. The other point I would like to make is about FDI. There is a discussion about FDI in the report. There is a discussion about the need for Indonesia to become more liberal towards FDI, but foreign direct investment. But this does not pick up the fact that in the last 20 or 30 years, Indonesia has had very considerable problems with FDI. The discussion of FDI is really not just a simple one of being more open to FDI. The fact is that there are pros and cons, and developing countries have real problems in dealing with foreign direct investment. Look, I'll leave it there. Terima kasih, Archo. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Let's hear from Peter War. Peter, you're on mute. Okay, go ahead.
I successfully unmuted?
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Andrea. Thank you, Hal, for those comments. I haven't been able to read the full report yet, but I have been able to download it to be read online, and I've skimmed the first chapter. I want to focus on what COVID-19 has changed within Indonesia. A lot of the report seems to be a kind of continuation of themes that were discussed in earlier reports. But I want to focus on what has changed as a result of COVID-19. And I'm drawing upon some work that I've done with a very distinguished Indonesian colleague, Arif Anshori Yusuf, who is at Pajajaran University. I just emailed him to try to find out whether he's online at the moment, and I think he's not. But in case he is, Arif, please feel free to jump in and talk over the top of me, because you'd be much better to present this idea. The idea is that the impact of COVID-19 seemed to be very much an urban thing. The infection rates were very much higher in urban areas, the job losses, the shutdowns, all that seemed to be very much urban focused. But what Arif noticed from the labour force survey data was a large movement of people apparently laid off from urban sector jobs back to rural areas. We're talking about something like 2.5 million people, judging from the labour force surveys, 2.5 million. They've gone back to rural areas. Now, our point is that in doing so, they're doing that in order to be able to find food, find some kind of employment. In doing that, they are competing with the rural unskilled workforce. Now, research on urban and rural labour markets in developing countries has shown that the demand is quite inelastic. That means that in order to absorb a big increase in employment within rural areas, especially in agriculture, wages have to fall a long way. So our prediction is a big decline in agricultural wages, rural wages generally, especially in agriculture. That's our prediction. And we have, thanks to Arif's efforts, we have some preliminary data that seem to indicate that that's exactly what is happening. So what that means is that this movement of labour force from rural to urban, urban to rural areas, reversing the long-term process of urbanization, is transferring the burden of the impact of COVID-19 from urban poor people to rural poor people, because rural wages are being forced down so much, according to us. So I'll stop right there. I'd love to hear some comment on that from anybody, starting with Andrea, if possible, please. And so that's our point.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Peter. Okay, Andrea, do you want to comment on the responses, or maybe briefly? Yeah.
First, let me repeat my thanks to Hal and others for the questions and the comments, and of course, which I will share, and especially the congratulations to the colleagues, which of course deserve the kudos. Let me go through some of the questions, maybe not all of them, some of the very appropriate questions on the data by Ross and by the anonymous attendee. Maybe I will reply personally, because I have to check. But let me go first to the comment by Peter McCauley on the work program, more generally the relationship between the OECD and Indonesian and other emerging market economies. Now, first is the first point is, I hope you can see me because I see it's shadowy. This is a joint work program, so the priorities are jointly defined by us and the government of Indonesia. It's not a neo-colonial relationship, so it's really a joint exercise. And I mean, I do agree with Peter on the kind of the risk of a Christmas tree. At the same time, again, first of all, it's a joint decision. The second is it's in the nature of the OECD. You can justifiably say that the OECD itself is a Christmas tree, but it's in the nature of the OECD to take a whole of government approach in order to build and maximize policy coherence across different policy areas. So, which is difficult enough, it's difficult enough to do in OECD countries, and it's possibly much more difficult in emerging market economies, not only because they are poorer and maybe to some extent less developed institutionally, but also because obviously OECD matters do not have the priority in non-members that they may have in OECD countries, and for obvious reasons. And with COVID, I mean, also the the possibility of traveling to Paris as an incentive to give more attention to OECD matters has disappeared. So I think that a Zoom meeting is not the same as dining in Montmartre. But seriously, I think that the issue is that the OECD is about policy coherence and rule of government approach. So in a way, we are running the risk that you mentioned, Peter, but we would be running a kind of new colonialist risk in saying, well, you are different, we just give you part of the OECD experience. I think that we want to do the same. On the comparisons, of course, I do and we do fully agree that the comparators should not be the OECD average. That's why we try to as much as possible to, in the survey and in other surveys, of course, also to make comparisons with either G20 emerging market economies or with the OECD emerging market economies, especially in Latin America and Central and Eastern Europe. So at the same time, I guess for institutional reasons, if you wish, we also provide the comparison with the OECD. Again, the same logic. I mean, it would be kind of, in a way, unfair. The OECD is a kind of the long-term objective of an emerging market economy, I guess, is to become like OECD. So at least you show all of this and you are from the frontier. But if it were only the comparison made with the OECD countries, I think it would be bad, but excluding the OECD countries from the comparison would also be bad. In terms of the FDI, of course, I do agree with you that Indonesia has had its problems with the FDI and with foreign investors. Not only Indonesia, of course, but other emerging economies also, and some other large emerging economies as well. But I would make two additional comments on that. One is that there is a risk, I mean, to the extent that doing business in Indonesia is difficult for statutory reasons and for de facto reasons, there is a kind of a risk of an adverse selection, that those that come are the worst foreign investors, because they are the only ones that have a different hurdle rate for their investment. So that you remove in an ideal world, you remove some at least of the obstacles and you attract better investors, investors that are more interested in their own long-term horizon, and to provide, to create, to generate good results for the economy. The second point, again, which is maybe tangential, but only to an extent, I think that Indonesia also is another feature of Indonesia compared to some other emerging market economies in the G20 and in Southeast Asia, is that it's not host of many of its own multinationals. Some, of course, of the unicorns have become multinationals of their own, but otherwise the so-called emerging market multinationals phenomenon is still not as developed in Indonesia as in, for instance, well, China, India, obviously, but also in other countries in Southeast Asia. So that's another point. And on the point, I mean, a very relevant point by Peter Ward, I was listening with a lot of attention because this is not something I knew. So I fully agree with the hypothesis, and I look forward to seeing whether these hypotheses are supported by the evidence. I think what I can just mention is that in India, something similar happened in different circumstances, but something similar happened in terms of recent rural to urban areas migrants returning to their home domiciles. And now what is happening in India, we see, and I wonder whether this will be also apparent in Indonesia, is that most of the people that migrated went back to rural areas now are returning to large cities, and so that was only a very temporary phenomenon. So I wonder whether that the same will happen in Indonesia, especially again if the scenario you are making unravels. So of course, if you go back to your rural place of birth to be poor, so you immediately try to move back to the urban city, urban areas as soon as the economic and material conditions improve. The point that Hal made about the sovereign wealth fund, and well, I mean, let me first say that and that I agree. I think we didn't use the word, but there is a risk of some complacency in some circles. I think in Indonesia was saying again that it was just 2%, so we are going back to 5%. But 5% itself is maybe not enough. Again, I mean, it's comparisons are always difficult and sometimes are hideous. But if you compare Indonesia with Vietnam, Vietnam is growing much faster. And again, I mean, there may be reasons why that has happened. So, I mean, an issue which I guess has been made very clear in many Indonesia updates, in many articles in the bulletin, is that Indonesia has achieved, even if maybe not a perfect, but still has achieved to a large extent a double transition, political as much as economical. So obviously that's something that must be recognized. At the same time, again, I think that there is a risk of complacency, which I think is something that indirectly both Hal and I referred to. And so that let me conclude on the sovereign wealth fund of the capital city. On the capital city, I mean, again, my opinion is as good as, actually it's much worse than yours, but it can be at best as good as yours. What I think is relevant is to see at what has happened in other countries. And again, Korea, maybe because it's a country I know a bit about. Korea launched, again, a country which is similar, but definitely not the same as Indonesia. In Korea, it took the best of 15 years to move the administrative CD, and only partially, to Sejong. So I don't think that if Rome was not made in a day, I don't think any new capital in Southeast Asia will be made in a day or even in 15 years. So, and obviously, I mean, the whole process. Now, there are obviously very good reasons for thinking of moving the capital, but again, I mean, the only thing I can say is that probably the expectations were exceedingly optimistic at the beginning. On the sovereign wealth fund, obviously, I think that Indonesians look at the experience of, even if each sovereign wealth fund has its own characteristic and it's sui generis, but plus, I guess Indonesians look at the experience of Malaysia with the sovereign wealth fund and may have some question marks, if not reservations. But I think that again, they are good. There is potentially in a case like Indonesia, in a country like Indonesia, I think for the sovereign wealth fund to play a role of catalyzer of investment, and I think that the first signals were, from that point of view, positive, of engaging with a number of sovereign wealth funds from other countries, with SoftBank from Japan, and that I guess is something that, again, if I would just to conclude, I would sum up, I guess you need a credible institution and a credible sovereign wealth fund in this case to generate that kind of positive externalities and catalyzing externalities. And so I guess the crucial thing is the governance of the sovereign wealth fund, and to make sure that it is a credible institution with which foreign investors want to relate, be they private or public. So that, I guess, the challenge, again, like with the KPK, like with the bank, on which, by the way, I guess there was a question by Ross on what we think about this, the proposal to reduce dependence. We certainly think that it's a very risky one, and I mean, we cannot oppose because we are not Indonesian citizens. So we can just say that it would be a bad signal and possibly something to reduce the efficiency and the usefulness of the action of the central bank to reduce its independence.
Thank you, Andrea. We actually have hit our time, but if I may, I'd like to invite very quick reaction from Ross McLeod, if you still have some comment, Ross, and then Terry Hall, and last but not least, Tessa Napitupulu, but very quickly, please. Start with Ross.
Thanks, Archo, and thanks, Andrea, for your presentation. It's good to know what folks in the OECD are thinking about Indonesia. Yeah, just looking at the list of questions that I've given there, it seems clear that the OECD recognizes that there are problems with the SOEs. To me, the most obvious solution to those problems is to get rid of them by privatizing. I don't imagine in my wildest dreams that you can privatize all of them, but why not make a start? I mean, Indonesian policymakers talk about this from time to time. It seems to come in bursts, but nothing much gets done. On the issue of corporate tax, this seems to provide a very large proportion of the government's total tax revenue. So my question there was just trying to get at how much of that total is really effectively natural resource rent taxation. In other words, per demeanor, I think contributes a hell of a lot of the corporate tax revenue. So it would be interesting to break out the tax revenue coming from private sector companies. And I think if you did that, the weak taxation collection effort of the government would then become even more stark, I think. And I think people would like to know about that. But given the lack of time, let me leave it there. Thanks, Archo.
Thank you, Ross. Terry?
Thank you very much, and thanks for a very stimulating seminar today. Hal has used my name in vain about the population numbers, but I think it will be quite important for us to get on top of this. The BPS released the 2020 Census Preliminary Report in January, and when we take the age distribution that they used in that report and use the demographic magic of some of the techniques we have, it produces a total fertility rate of 1.4, which is about the level of China right now. I think that the interpretation is not that fertility has fallen so much, but rather that births have been underreported. We see that in the 0 to 4-year-olds, which is much smaller than we would expect. So instead of 270 million population, which the BPS published, and the 271 million that the Ministry of Home Affairs published for January, we might be looking at something like 280 million, an undercount of perhaps 10 million. I say perhaps because we have to do a lot more work before we can actually come up with some adjustments. The problem is that the President and the BPS and the Ministry of Home Affairs do not approve of adjustments. So I think international institutions like the OECD, the World Bank, and the UN Population Division are going to be facing a difficult choice as to whether they adjust the Indonesian population, which will affect things like per capita income, per capita anything. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Terry. Last is Teza Napitupulu. Teza?
Hi, thanks, Acho. This is Teza Napitupulu from the World Resources Institute, Indonesia. In relation to multilateral cooperation, what are the effort or opportunities the OECD sees to create significant change in environmental management, especially meeting climate ambition, global action? This is in line also with what Peter has been saying, maybe also in line with targeting economic recovery, poverty alleviation, or food security program in better management of food, fisheries, land use sectors. Thank you.
Thank you, Teza. So over to you, Andrea.
Yeah, thanks again for the questions. I will go through them rapidly because each of them, of course, deserves first on what Terry was saying. It's very interesting, but I'm not a demographer, and so I can only say that it's very interesting, and I will pass it to our colleagues that work, if not on demographic, on similar issues. But thanks a lot. On the privatization, on this question, I think. I mean, I fully agree with you on the need to, of course, do something in a way, and but the problem, I guess, is one of political economy. An IPO, think of any of the larger SOEs. I think an Indonesian IPO would be definitely not sufficient to privatize. A global IPO or an investment by strategic overseas may be resisted at this stage, especially with the elections approaching. I think the current situation is not conducive to that kind of sale to the foreign investor. And then I guess the real risk, and again, I'll say, I mean, that we know from 30 years of experience around the world that ownership is important, but the market conditions are much more important. So substituting, again, I mean, I'm just saying something obvious, but substituting a public monopolist with a private monopolist that doesn't lead to a great deal of advancement. And the real risk there, of course, and we have seen in so many countries, is the further entrenchment and empowerment of oligarchs, just to use a term that everybody understands. I guess we all understand, and we have seen privatization failing and not fulfilling the ambitions and expectations of the reformists, at least in so many countries where, and that is a real risk, of course, in Indonesia, much more than, and again, Pierre van der Hen, who is an expert on income distribution, knows much better than me how important are the potential oligarchs in the Indonesian context. And on the environment, thanks a lot to Teza for the question. I think, well, we act at three levels, I would say. One is in terms of our recommendations, again, time to go through. So in terms of influence the policy debate, I mean, obviously, these are recommendations. As I'll say at the beginning, we don't have any lending operation, which makes us more neutral in a way, and possibly rather credible, but still we don't have any enforcement mechanism. So ours are just recommendations. And so there are recommendations. There is the work on development finance, especially the green component of development finance, which is something which, again, I mean, we have the box in the survey on. And finally is our involvement, and on this I can conclude, in fact, with the G20. We are, as you know, Indonesia was expected to chair the G20 in 2023. 2022 was supposed to be India, and then all of a sudden, oh, I mean, maybe not all of a sudden, but at least to me and to pundits, all of a sudden they decided to reverse the order, and so now Indonesia has very little time to organize what is going to be obviously a very challenging G20. I mean, all G20s are challenging, but some are more challenging than others, and with so little time. So, but obviously Indonesia will put a lot of emphasis on environmental considerations, also on the ocean, which is something that again receives attention in alternate years. They did with Japan with the plan, and I think that I'm sure that it will also receive a lot of attention. And the OECD is working with the Indonesian government on this. So of course are working, and obviously in the environment, in the Paris Agreement, biodiversity, all these are issues which are relevant for us as they are for Indonesia. So that's where we, and on each of these topics, of course, we also work a lot with stakeholders, non-governmental stakeholders, including the WRI with Alan Watford in Washington. So obviously we do cooperate with many. And again, thanks a lot, and hopefully next survey I will be in Canberra to present, or we'll decide with Hal.
Yeah, I'd like to thank everyone, all the participants, but especially the speakers, Andrea Goldstein, and also commentators, Hal Hill. Thank you so much for stimulating and insightful discussion. And with that, let me turn this over to Nuke, who will tell us what's coming next week. Thank you,
Acho. Next week, we will have a global seminar with the title, Vaccines Are Here, Now What? So, we have Dian Fatwa from MPR RI and Andre Suryanta. There are the head COVIDs, and Andre will also present his research on vaccine distribution in Indonesia. Thank you. And with that, I will close this webinar. Thanks.
Thank you.